Hey folks, David Stewart here. Time to talk a little bit more about anime. Today, a little bit of a change of pace. Love, Chunibyo, and other Delusions. This is a high school romantic comedy anime from a couple years ago that I didn't watch when it was new, but I remember the memes, and so I thought it'd be fun to go back and watch it, and I'm glad I did. I think it's actually really good. I think it's very, very well constructed and well written, and I'll dig into how they actually accomplished what they were accomplishing in this video. I think it's very, very well done, and I would recommend it for people who like that sort of thing if you haven't watched it yet. What I do find interesting, just before I go further about anime, is I noticed that there's a lot more male viewership of romantic comedy stuff than the Western versions of this. In the West, romantic comedies tend to be very, very focused on the female demographic, including a whole literature genre called chick lit, which is basically romantic comedy literature. Very, very much heavily focused on the female demographic. That's mostly who reads it, kind of like romance. So I find it interesting that, I've talked to lots of males who've watched shows like this. So I thought it'd be fun to talk about it. I think it's a well-constructed show. Basic premise is this. There's this thing called Chunibyo, which the best way I could translate that is the Chunibyo literally means like middle school syndrome or middle school disease. And it is age inappropriate pretend play that is embarrassing or cringe. So it is you are acting out, say, a pretend persona in a way that's very much age inappropriate. So you're doing it in high school and middle school rather than doing it when it's appropriate when you're like 5 or 6. So it's an overspilling of the childhood pretend play into areas that are when you're supposed to be leaving that childhood stuff behind. Now, the main setup for the conflict is you have two main characters, Yuta and Rika. Yuta is going to a new high school because he had this Chunibyo thing. He was acting out these delusions of grandeur in middle school and pretending to be something he wasn't. He called himself the Dark Flame Master, and he's so embarrassed about that, thinking about it and feeling this like inner cringe about it. Cringe is like the best word I can think to describe this. He has to go to a new high school that's going to be new people that don't know that he was like this. So he's going to pretend to be a normal high school. And that pretending is very, very important for the way that this anime was constructed, and I presume the light novel that it's based off of. I haven't read the light novel. The other main character, Rika, actually lives in the apartment above Yuta, and she has full-blown Chunibyo. And so the first episode, Yuta's going to this new high school to avoid people knowing that he was like a Chunibyo, and he meets Rika, who is full-blown Chunibyo. She's wearing this medical eye patch. She pretends to have this Wicked Lord Shingen inside of her eye that's giving her powers and telling her what to do. She rolls around on shoes that have little roller skates on them, which I guess is a kid thing, something that's more popular with kids. And he feels very embarrassed about it, not just because her behavior is kind of cringe, but because that reflects back on himself, that he sees a bit of himself in her. And as they get to know each other better, kind of reluctantly, she finds out, or he's trying to hide the fact that he pretended to be Dark Flame Master. And she finds out about that, and she thinks it's really cool. That's something that she really likes about him. But he doesn't like it. He doesn't want people to know about it. So in that first episode, that's how they set up most of the conflict that's going to happen through this. It's a genuinely funny show, lots of comedy in it. One of the things I liked is the characters will have these like fights, these pretend play fights. And when that happens, they go like full bore animation as if it's real. Like they're jumping up in the sky, swinging giant swords around, like magic's flying everywhere. It's them imagining it, but they have these really full scale animations of it that really give the show a lot of flavor and a lot of humor to it. Definitely when the show begins, it has this strong humor element to it. It's very funny. Then in the middle, this was really started to surprise me as the show went on. It starts to take on this much more melancholy flavor and atmosphere, and then it ends with something that's like very, very heartfelt, very sad, but like a very big resolution to all of the big conflicts that are going on. Why Rika is a Chunibyo, what Yuta's trying to avoid, all that stuff really comes together at the end in a way that was way stronger and way better executed than I thought after watching the first episode. It kind of starts with comedy, it leads with comedy, and then it goes into this really great melancholy mood towards the middle or back half of the series, and then it ends with some great kind of dark sadness, but that's also a big release. It has a happy ending, by the way. So if you're looking for a happy ending, it has a happy ending, and it resolves most of the things that it sets out. It resolves most of its conflicts, which I guess a lot of manga and anime, in order to have the series persist, they often don't resolve a lot of those conflicts. In this one, it does, and it does it really well at the end of the first season. So that's really how it gets set up. Let me go into, I talked about setting a little bit. Setting's not that much. It's Japan high school. We'll talk about characters, because the characters, what binds all these characters together is they are all pretending on some way. And this reflection really gets made very obvious towards the end of the series. Yuta is embarrassed about pretending to be Dark Flame Master, but he's also pretending to be a normal high school student. In other words, he's pretending that element, being really into anime or being really into sci-fi shows and acting that out, that's not part of him. He's pretending to be a normal high school student, and that's exactly what he sets out to do at the beginning of the series. He goes to high school to try to act normal, and that's what he's trying to do. Rika, on the other hand, as a contrast, is just full Chunibyo. She's just acting out her persona all the time. At the same time, there are many places where her real personality comes through, and her real personality is one that's much more anxious, much more introverted, much more demure. It's a big contrast to this persona she puts out where she's confident and has these sorts of things. And so she's pretending to be something she's not as well in order to avoid dealing with who she really is at her fundamental core. So you have this duality between those two characters. And one of the things that I find really funny about Rika is these moments where her personality, her persona sort of fails, are these moments where you end up really liking the character because you get to see who she is. Now, I will interject at this moment. I didn't mention this before. I watched the subtitled version of this. I watched this in the original Japanese, and I recommend you do the same. I usually will say that's a matter of preference, and I guess it always is. I watched one episode of the dub, and wow, the dub misses Rika's personality hugely. Her personality comes across as completely different and, to me, nonsensical in the English dub version. The voice acting, whoever was directing the voice acting, she has this flat affect most of the time. That's not Rika at all. Rika has a much more intense personality for her persona and a much more stammering, awkward personality for her inner self. That's much more apparent when you watch it in Japanese. The Japanese voice acting lends a completely different dimension to Rika's character. In fact, I think if you were to watch the English dub, you'd come off with a different idea of who Rika really is, based on the way that the acting is, and based on the way that the English voice acting is done, and maybe what translations and what words they choose to kind of cram in there and try to make her character what she is. In fact, there's this great moment where Rika is saying that she has a ghost of a 19th century English woman inside of her. And they're talking to a school administrator, and she's doing this completely serious. She takes her little persona very seriously and does it full bore. And so the teacher just starts talking to her in English. Now, you're going to miss the comedy of this if you're trying to watch a dub, because you won't just hear the teacher start talking English. So if you speak English and you're watching the sub, she just starts speaking English, and then Rika, her entire personality breaks down, and she gets very embarrassed and flustered and starts stammering and saying random English words. And it's very funny. I just don't see how that element of comedy could be translated into English when the element of comedy is their English, but it also reveals something about the character Rika that you're just going to miss, I think, in the dubbed version. So anyway, that's Rika. She's pretending to be Chunibyo to protect herself. That actually becomes more apparent as the plot goes on. There's another great character that's added into this named Shinka, and she is basically the same as Yuta. She went to a new high school where she could be very popular, and she's a pretty girl because she was Chunibyo. And her secret, kind of like how Rika discovers Yuta's secret, her secret's discovered by Rika and one of Rika's friends, Dekomori, who figure out that she used to have this online persona called Mori Summer. And Mori Summer wrote all these magic dissertations, and she deleted the blog. She wrote it on a blog. This was done before the age of smartphones and stuff, so blogs were big in like 2010. And turns out that they had like downloaded the entire blog and printed it out and saved it. So Shinka ends up in this position where she has to pretend, she has to basically be friends with them and get on the good side of Rika and Dekomori, because she doesn't want her secret to get out, her horrible Chunibyo secret. So kind of like Yuta, she's trying to pretend to be something she's not. She's trying to ignore her past of pretending to be Mori Summer. There's another great character called Kumin, and Kumin is an older, they call her senpai, so she's like a year older. And she is a contrast to all the other characters in the series in that she's exactly who she is. She's trying to start a club for napping, and she's like, fine, we'll make it the napping and like ancient magic club. I don't remember what they call it, but they come up with their own weird little club that's half napping, which is what she's interested in, and half Chunibyo stuff. And she's totally herself, and she's completely comfortable being herself. And even at the end of the series, she's completely comfortable putting on a Chunibyo personality to try to influence Yuta in some way. She really just doesn't have any hang-ups about being herself. This is a contrast to all the other characters who are basically trying to pretend to be something they are not. There's Dekomori, who is a younger student. She's an actual middle school student, and she looks up to Rika as, I guess, a leader figure, calls her like her master or something like that, and is trying to duplicate the Chunibyo effects that Rika does because she thinks that's cool. And she, of course, has some of the same things where she has an inner personality that she's basically trying to hide by putting on this front. And part of that inner personality is like a deep caring for Rika and a deep understanding of who Rika really is. So she puts on a bit of her front to kind of play along with what Rika's doing. There's another character named Makoto, and he is, again, doing the same thing. He's pretending to be something he's not. He's joins the light music club and carries around a guitar, hoping that girls will like him. He's really obsessed with girls liking him. He doesn't know how to play the guitar. You never really see him play the guitar at all. Rather, he's doing things to try to get the attention of girls. And so that's another different permutation of this big idea. People pretending to be something they're not. So as we get into the plot, what ends up happening is over the course of the series, the characters are confronted with their true selves and have to figure out how to adjust to that. So one of the things that happens is Rika and Yuta, they develop a close friendship. That friendship starts to turn into romantic feelings which they're not really wanting to express to each other. So Yuta, despite the way that he treats Yuta despite the way he treats Rika in the beginning, which is kind of slapsticky. You see him like hitting her on top of the head and teasing her all the time and telling her how cringe she is and acting embarrassed about her. He develops real authentic care for this person and ends up basically in a romantic relationship. And that's what happens in this kind of melancholy midpoint. Past the midpoint, it starts to take on this really melancholy flavor because these two characters are kind of rotating around each other, he's having to come to terms with the fact that he really does care about this person despite the fact that she is acting like a Chunibyo, and he takes it upon himself to fix this about her, and this ends up causing a lot of distress for himself and for Rika. In one way, there's a big moment where basically they back out of doing this dramatic performance where she was going to act out her Chunibyo stuff because he feels like she needs to grow up. And what they've really figured out, what gets revealed, and this is a spoiler, just deal with it, is that Rika is dealing with a trauma and that her father died a few years before, or not that long before, but her father died a few years before. And no one had told her he was sick. And this is a thing in some cultures where you believe if you tell the person that they're sick, then that will distress them before the end of their life. And if you tell other people the person's sick, then they will be distressed before the end of that person's life. It's not just Japan. There's other cultures that have this attitude where they don't tell people they're dying, or they don't tell the family members that the person is dying. They kind of skirt around it so people don't end up with a bunch of feelings like this person's dying. So she's very traumatized by this. And so her response, it turns out since she lives in the apartment above Yuta, she's actually watched Yuta, she adopts a similar personality to what Yuta had done and takes on this Chunibyo personality to protect herself from having to deal with this reality. So she's always searching for these, she calls them the invisible boundary lines. And that's the boundary lines between life and death. Life where she is and death where her father has been taken. And she, at the end of this series, there's this great heartfelt moment where basically Yuta in this pretending is like, I see the invisible boundary lines out there. We found them. And so she's finally able to say goodbye to her father and resolve some of that trauma and accept who she is and what's actually happened. And then they get chased by the police and run off on a bicycle away from the beach. And then there's a little monologue at the end. So it's a great ending to this bigger conflict of who you are and who you're trying to protect and who are you trying to pretend not to be. Yuta at the same time has to come to accept that he has this Chunibyo past because he has to act it out with Rika in order to have the relationship he wants to have with her. So he has to accept who he is in order to be in this romantic relationship with Rika, and she has to accept that her father has died in order to move forward with her own life. And I thought it was such a perfect ending to the series. I really didn't want to watch anything after that because it just tied everything up so nicely. Because one of the things that happens is if you want to follow this up, now you have to make the characters regress. You have to make them move backwards in order to have some of the same flavor you had in this first season where everybody's a Chunibyo and there's full cringe and people are fully committing to it. After the resolution of the entire plot, Rika really can't commit to being a full Chunibyo anymore. Rather, that's just has to be a small aspect of who she is, and she has to also be her more authentic inner self. Likewise, Yuta has to accept that he can't just pretend to be a normal person who never did these things, that his, otaku kind of tendencies are part of who he is, and his Chunibyo tendencies are part of who he is. All that stuff gets resolved really nicely at the end of the series and with the end of the plot. And we also have some revelations from the other characters. We have the other characters basically say, I'm not sure which I think it's Shinka says to Yuta, like, you're pretending to be a normal high school student. And I am too. So you're still pretending. You're castigating Rika for pretending to be something she's not, but you're pretending to be something that you're not. And you have to go fix that. So towards that last act, what happens is Rika ends up going to stay with her grandparents and disappears from school. And so Yuta has to actively take a role in going to find her and see her and see how she's doing. He no longer is the passive recipient of affection from Rika. He has to be an active participant in it. That's also a meaningful change for the character, and part of his growth is he has to stop being passive about how he feels about Rika and actively go seek her out and have the moments that he needs to have with her at the end of the series. So all that stuff wraps up really nicely, and I thought it was a great series, and that's my story analysis for it and why I think it's really, really well executed. In general, there's a great execution at the micro level of comedy, slapstick comedy, the feelings of cringe, all the funny situations that they get into episode by episode, which we don't have the time to get into here. But on the macro level, that's where everything really comes together, where there's a feeling of things moving into this more melancholy area where you're trying to resolve feelings to a full kind of catharsis for how the characters actually view themselves, and a resolution and a change and a growth for the two main characters to finally resolve it. And it ends with a happy ending, which is them being boyfriend and girlfriend, I guess, being in their romantic relationship that they weren't really able to accept before they could do the growing and accept who they really were. So all of those things are really well done. I was actually very surprised how well written the story was and how well executed the story was. So anyway, I do recommend it, and I really enjoyed watching it, and I did like a lot of the reveals that they used, and it had a very heartfelt ending, but was still funny pretty much the whole way through. There was always some comic relief, even when you're in these more melancholy episodes. So let me know what you think down below, and I will see you guys next time. Have a great one.